You don't know it yet, but you've been waiting for this moment for a long time. This didn't reach you by accident. There are moments that don't announce themselves. They find you. And this is one of those narrow windows where timing matters more than effort. Something is lining up in a way that doesn't repeat often. You don't need motivation for this moment, because what's happening right now doesn't care how ready you feel. Right now, there's another event unfolding that most people aren't even aware of. Today and tomorrow, the Geminids meteor shower is peaking. This will absolutely affect you, especially if you're spiritually attuned. Soon, you'll see exactly how this ties into your breakthrough and why this timing matters more than you think. But first, you need to understand who this moment reaches and why it always arrives at a specific stage in your life. Breakthroughs don't arrive when someone feels powerful, inspired, or certain. They arrive when the version of you that needed reassurance finally runs out of energy. This moment shows up when identity loosens, when you're no longer trying to prove anything, impress anyone, or defend who you are. That's why it feels like a low point, not because something is wrong, but because something unnecessary is finally stepping aside. Most people mistake this phase for failure because it doesn't feel productive. There's no adrenaline, no emotional charge, just a quiet sense that the old way of holding yourself together isn't working anymore. And that's exactly the point. As long as you're busy maintaining an identity, there's no room for life to rearrange itself around who you're becoming. This isn't punishment, it's clearance. The part of you that needed control, certainty, or recognition is slowly losing its grip. That loss feels uncomfortable because it leaves you exposed. But exposure is the condition required for change. Nothing new enters a life that's already full. Right now, something is being emptied on purpose. This is why the timing feels cruel but precise. You don't get this moment when you're strong enough to force outcomes. You get it when forcing no longer works. When effort gives way to honesty. When the noise drops and what remains is unfiltered. That's the doorway, not when you feel ready, but when you stop pretending you are. This is the phase where quitting feels reasonable. You've already tried. You've already persisted. You've already waited longer than you thought you should. From a surface-level perspective, stopping makes sense because nothing appears to be changing. That's why this moment is so dangerous. Doubt doesn't show up before effort. It shows up after it's been invested. Most people assume doubt means they're off track. But doubt is often a response to delayed confirmation. Momentum doesn't announce itself while it's forming. It builds quietly below the surface while the mind is busy asking whether any of this is worth it. That's why this phase feels pointless, because the payoff hasn't arrived yet, and the brain hates unfinished loops. The closer something is to clicking, the more convincing the argument to quit becomes. If this were going to work, it would have worked by now. That thought feels rational, clean, mature even. But it's also the thought that erases accumulated momentum in one decision. You don't lose progress gradually. You lose it all at once when you walk away. This is the only phase where quitting feels like self-respect instead of fear. And that's the trap. Because if you quit earlier, it was emotional. If you quit later, it's irrelevant. But quitting here cuts the signal right before it stabilizes. This moment isn't asking you to push harder or believe more. It's asking you not to interrupt what's already in motion. Meteor showers don't wait for applause. They don't pause for spectators. They appear quietly, consistently, and only reveal their beauty to those who are already still enough to notice. That's the pattern of how meaningful shifts actually work. At this stage, breakthroughs don't respond to force, intensity, or repeated effort. They respond to presence. Most people are conditioned to believe that if something hasn't happened yet, they need to push harder, think louder, or want it more. But this phase operates on a different rule entirely. The internal noise has to drop first. The constant checking, the mental rehearsing, the subtle desperation for signs. All of that obscures the shift while it's forming. If you're finding value in this, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe. I create this content for people navigating moments exactly like this one, where the usual answers don't land anymore. Your subscription helps me continue making these videos, and it means you'll have this space when you need it most. Please consider it. Now let's continue. Clarity doesn't arrive when you chase it. It appears when you stop blocking it. This is why stillness isn't passive here. It's participatory. When the internal pressure eases, perception sharpens. You start noticing patterns instead of forcing outcomes. You feel less urgency but more certainty. The breakthrough doesn't need to be summoned anymore because it's already in motion. And the quieter you become inside, the more obvious that motion starts to feel. This is the moment where effort turns counterproductive, not because effort was wrong, but because its job is done. Just like the Geminids don't need witnesses to burn across the sky, your next shift doesn't need validation to happen. It only needs space. What most spiritually attuned people experience right before a real breakthrough isn't physical exhaustion. It's a deeper fatigue that settles in quietly. The kind that lingers no matter how much rest you get. This exhaustion comes from carrying unanswered questions for too long, from holding space for an outcome that hasn't revealed itself yet. It's the mental weight of uncertainty. You've done the reflection. You've stayed patient. You've waited without forcing. And still there's that persistent question. Is this actually leading somewhere, or am I just standing still? That question alone drains more energy than action ever could. Uncertainty doesn't shout. It slowly wears you down. Emotionally, this phase feels like restraint. You're not reacting anymore, but you're also not celebrating. You've learned how to stay composed while something unresolved sits in your chest. And that restraint over time becomes heavy. It's exhausting to remain steady without resolution. It's tiring to hold faith without feedback. This is why even simple tasks can feel strangely demanding, not because they're difficult, but because your emotional energy is being used elsewhere. There's also a subtle fear woven into this fatigue, not fear of failure, but fear that the effort might not matter, that maybe all the patience, restraint, and persistence won't translate into something tangible. That fear doesn't create panic. It creates numbness. And numbness is often misunderstood as apathy when it's actually self-protection. When hope has waited too long, it learns how to stay quiet. This is why people feel disconnected right before things click, not because they've lost interest, but because their system is conserving energy. The mind starts to slow down. The emotional spikes flatten. The constant internal commentary softens. And while that can feel like losing momentum, it's actually a recalibration, a shift from effort to inevitability. This exhaustion is the threshold, the moment where the question has been held long enough that it's about to answer itself. The tiredness you're feeling isn't a sign you've gone too far. It's a sign you've gone far enough. This phase doesn't feel peaceful, and that's what confuses people. It feels like something is missing. Conversations dry up without explanation. People who once checked in regularly fade into the background. Invitations slow. Feedback disappears. Even your own drive changes. You're not energized, but you're not hopeless either. You're just still. Most people interpret this as being forgotten or left behind. But that assumption misses what's actually happening. External noise begins to drop when it no longer serves you. The opinions, reactions, and validations that once shaped your decisions start pulling away. And without them, you're left facing something unfamiliar, your own unfiltered awareness. When life goes quiet, it's not ignoring you. It's isolating the signal. This is why the silence feels uncomfortable instead of soothing. You're no longer buffered by distractions. There's nothing to react to, nothing to chase, nothing to resist. The mind doesn't get its usual inputs, so it starts reaching for meaning, wondering if something went wrong. But nothing broke. The interference was removed. This isn't loneliness, it's precision. Signal isolation only feels empty when you're used to static. Another unsettling part of this phase, is how neutral everything becomes. Emotional highs flatten out. Lows don't hit as hard either. You're not pulled strongly in any direction, and that lack of contrast can feel disorienting. People often mistake emotional neutrality for apathy, but it's stabilization. The nervous system stops swinging because it's preparing to register something more subtle. This is also why distractions lose their grip here. The things that once pulled your attention don't satisfy the same way. You scroll, but it feels hollow. You socialize, but it feels thin. You rest, but it doesn't fully land. That's misalignment being exposed. Nothing entertains you right now because something is rearranging beneath the surface. This phase removes every excuse to avoid what's about to move. There's no chaos to blame, no drama to hide in, no urgency to distract you, just space. And in that space, the next shift becomes unavoidable. The quiet isn't asking you to do anything. It's making sure nothing else gets in the way. When people decide to watch a meteor shower, they imagine instant reward. They expect the sky to cooperate, to perform on cue, to justify their attention quickly. But that's not how it works. The first few minutes are usually empty. The sky looks exactly the same as it always does. No movement, no confirmation. And that's where most people fail the test without realizing one was happening at all. They look away not because they're impatient, but because the stillness starts to feel awkward. Standing there with nothing happening forces you to sit with anticipation. And anticipation without payoff triggers doubt. You start thinking maybe you missed it. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe this wasn't worth stepping outside for in the first place. So you disengage. You scroll. You leave. And in doing so, you remove yourself from the only condition required for witnessing something rare. Staying present longer than feels reasonable. This isn't about meteors. It's about the human tendency to abandon moments that don't immediately reward us. We're conditioned to expect feedback fast, and when it doesn't arrive, we assume nothing is coming. But the brightest streaks don't appear on demand. They arrive after stretches of nothing, after your attention has been tested, after you've decided whether you're willing to wait without guarantees. Patience isn't passive. It's the ability to stay without reassurance. The irony is that most people don't miss these moments by being late. They miss them by leaving early. They step away seconds or minutes before the sky finally moves. And because they never see the result, they conclude there was nothing to see at all. That conclusion feels logical, even comforting. But it's also wrong. Something happened. They just weren't there to witness it. This is where the warning matters, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise one. If you look away now, you won't feel an immediate consequence. There won't be a clear sign you made the wrong choice. You'll simply return to normal, carrying the quiet belief that nothing was about to happen anyway. And that belief will feel justified because you never stayed long enough to be proven otherwise. This moment doesn't demand belief, effort, or intensity. It demands endurance. Just staying present a little longer than feels necessary. Because some shifts don't arrive loudly. They arrive the moment you decide not to leave. The rarest moments aren't hidden. They're just timed for those who don't walk away. After the click happens, life doesn't ease you into change. It moves, not in a chaotic or overwhelming way, but with a quiet certainty that feels almost impersonal. Situations that felt stuck for months suddenly resolve themselves. Conversations shift tone. People who were hesitant become direct. Doors that required constant pushing before now open with minimal effort, sometimes without you even reaching for the handle. It's not dramatic, it's efficient. What's strange is that this movement doesn't wait for you to feel confident about it. You may still be processing the long pause that came before, still feeling cautious or uncertain, yet momentum shows up anyway. That's because confidence was never the requirement. Alignment was. Life doesn't accelerate when you believe harder. It accelerates when resistance drops. And resistance often disappears quietly. This is where a lot of people misinterpret what's happening. They think they finally became more capable, more deserving, or more spiritually advanced. But what's actually changed is simpler. The internal friction that delayed outcomes has dissolved. The endless questioning, second-guessing, and need for reassurance no longer interfere with movement. Without that drag, things progress naturally, almost mechanically, like a system returning to its intended speed. Once this phase begins, timing feels different. Events cluster closer together. Decisions that once took weeks now take hours. Opportunities appear without explanation, not as rewards, but as responses. Alignment doesn't ask for confidence. It creates it after the fact. That's why this stage can feel surreal. You're moving forward before you've fully caught up emotionally. Life doesn't slow down to check whether you're comfortable. It doesn't pause to make sure you feel ready, healed, or certain. It simply continues responding to the state you're now in. The momentum sustains itself because there's nothing left blocking it. You don't have to chase or maintain it. You just stop interrupting it. This is why people often look back and say once it started, everything happened fast. Not because something suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but because the waiting phase ended all at once. After the click, life stops negotiating. It stops testing patience. It stops asking if you're prepared. It moves. And the only real choice left is whether you move with it or try to slow it back down out of habit. One of the most psychologically exhausting parts of this entire process is watching other people move forward while your own life appears to be standing still. You see announcements, progress, clarity, momentum, and it quietly triggers the thought that they must have access to something you don't. Better timing, better instincts, better understanding. And even when you try not to compare, the mind does it automatically, filling in gaps with assumptions that always point back to self-doubt. What makes this especially deceptive is that comparison never shows you the full timeline. You only see the moment someone breaks through, not the months or years where nothing moved for them at all. You don't see the long stretches of uncertainty, the moments where they questioned whether any of it mattered, or the times they almost walked away completely. Comparison doesn't measure reality. It measures visibility, and visibility always arrives late in the process. This is why comparison hurts most right before your own shift. You're close enough to notice movement around you, but not yet seeing your own reflected back. That gap creates the illusion that you're behind, when in reality, you're simply in the quiet phase that precedes acceleration. Being early feels indistinguishable from being wrong, and being in between feels like being forgotten, even when it isn't. There's also a deeper layer to this. When you see others move ahead, it threatens the story you tell yourself about how progress is supposed to look. Linear, fair, predictable. But growth doesn't follow a cue. It follows alignment. And alignment doesn't respect effort the way the ego expects it to. This is where self-doubt starts masquerading as realism. You tell yourself you're just being honest, just being grounded, just managing expectations. But underneath that is fear that your moment might not come at all. That fear grows louder the longer you wait, because waiting without feedback feels like rejection. And the mind hates unanswered questions more than bad answers. What almost no one realizes is that the people you're comparing yourself to aren't ahead of you. They're just visible now. Visibility is a phase, and it comes only after long periods of invisibility that most people never talk about. Once this clicks, comparison starts losing its power because you stop measuring worth by timing. When your moment arrives, it won't feel like catching up. It will feel like things finally making sense in the order they were always meant to happen. This phase is harder than everything that came before it, and that's the part almost no one expects. Earlier stages at least give you something to react to. Resistance, struggle, emotional highs and lows. Even chaos can feel reassuring because it confirms movement. But the final hour strips all of that away. There's no tension to fight, no obvious obstacle to overcome, no visible signal telling you that you're still on the right track. Just stillness. and stillness offers no evidence. Here, belief isn't supported by results, encouragement, or progress you can measure. You're no longer fueled by hope or excitement. You're left with unanswered questions and a quiet sense of uncertainty that doesn't scream. It lingers. The mind starts circling thoughts that feel disturbingly reasonable. What if this isn't going anywhere? What if I misunderstood everything? What if patience was just another word for waiting too long? These aren't panic thoughts. They're tired thoughts. And that's why they're so convincing. What makes this hour uniquely difficult is that nothing externally demands your persistence anymore. There's no urgency pushing you forward, no fear pulling you back. The decision to stay becomes entirely internal. That's where most people struggle because internal endurance isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels dull, unrewarded, and lonely. Endurance without feedback is the hardest form of strength. But this phase isn't empty. It's compressive. Everything you've learned, questioned, released, and endured is being condensed into something stable. Earlier phases expand you. This one fortifies you. It develops the capacity to hold outcomes without needing them to define you. And that capacity is critical because what comes next requires steadiness. If something arrived before this point, it would overwhelm you or be mishandled. If clarity came too early, it would turn into dependency. If momentum returned before this internal quiet, it would collapse under pressure. This is why the final hour exists, not to delay you, but to prepare you. What you can't hold, you can't keep. This is also why the timing feels cruelly precise. The final hour begins when motivation fades and certainty disappears. It asks you to stay without proof, to remain present without reassurance, and to trust alignment without confirmation. That's belief in process. And once you pass this threshold, you don't just reach the next phase. You're able to sustain it. That's what makes this hour the hardest, not because it demands more effort, but because it demands less interference, less questioning, less reaching, less trying to control the moment before it resolves. And for most people, restraint is far more difficult than action. Before we wrap up, I want to ask something. If this resonated with you, please subscribe. I make these videos for people in exactly this phase, when everything feels still but something is clearly shifting underneath. Subscribing means you'll find your way back here when you need these reminders most. I'd be grateful if you did. Now let's finish this. Most people don't quit because they're weak or incapable. They quit because the environment goes quiet and the mind demands a conclusion. Earlier stages at least give you something to react to. Resistance, setbacks, visible obstacles. But this phase removes all of that. There's no friction, no feedback, no clear signal that says keep going or stop now. And the human mind is deeply uncomfortable without resolution. When nothing seems to be happening, the brain fills the gap with interpretation. It starts rewriting the story. Maybe this was wishful thinking. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe I misunderstood what this meant. These thoughts don't arrive as panic. They arrive as logic. Calm, reasonable logic. That's what makes this moment so deceptive. The most convincing lies are the ones that sound rational. Quitting here doesn't feel like failure. It feels like maturity, like finally being honest with yourself. You tell yourself you're choosing realism over fantasy, clarity over false hope. And in the short term, it actually feels relieving. The internal tension drops, the waiting ends, the pressure disappears. But that relief comes from cutting the line. What most people never realize is how narrow the margin is at this point. They don't walk away from something that was far off. They walk away from something that was stabilizing, consolidating, getting ready to move. Momentum doesn't always announce itself while it's forming. Sometimes it goes silent because everything is being aligned behind the scenes. And walking away in that silence means you never find out how close you actually were.